All right, thanks, Brian, and thanks to the organizers and funders. This has been amazing, and thanks for hanging out this long. I know we've had a cram-packed schedule. That previous talk was fantastic. Over the last several years, my colleagues and I, we've been thinking a lot about the rise of misinformation. And we're thinking a lot about what's changed from what it was maybe 30, 40 years ago and what's happening today, something that we see in the news every day. I think everyone sort of has been tracking this thing. And part of it is that these digital technologies have been facilitating the creation and the spread and the consumption of misinformation. I'll just kind of stick with that term instead of fake news or disinformation. For better or for worse, Twitter and Facebook, mostly for the worse, allows us to fall in love with our ideas and our reflections, maybe more so than previously. So today what I want to talk about is how that might relate to what's going on in science and how what's going on in the sort of broader world and society around this problem, how we can sort of bring in sort of meta-science ideas and approaches and thinking to maybe contribute to maybe some of the solution to the problem. Today I'll focus on one specific kind of technology, search engines and recommender systems, and how that may be affecting negatively what we're doing at a macro level in science. So, for the rest of the talk, I'm pretty critical of technology. I work in a technology school, and we really spend a lot of time thinking about that interface between technology and society and humans. And we don't really talk about all the good things. So I'll just put one slide and then allow me to critique it for the rest of the time. I still wouldn't go back to not having Facebook and Twitter. And even though I talk about all this sort of problems, Carl Bergstrom and I talk a lot about the problems it's brought to the world. But what it has done is it really has amplified diverse voices. It's allowed collective action like we've never seen before, political action, social action. It's brought a lot. It's changed the way we organize as individuals, communicate. It changes the way we communicate through organizations and institutions. It's done a lot of good things. But there was my one slide for it. The rise of misinformation and sort of the attack on public discourse, is something we should be worried about. And in fact, I really think it's the most pressing problem of our time. I don't think we can even solve climate change or human health or population health or any of these kind of big problems until we get this one right. So you may be wondering, so I should just say real quickly that my colleagues, Carl Bergstrom and I and other colleagues at the University of Washington are starting this new center. And one of the core aspects of this center will be issues around meta-science and how sort of meta-science and science of science methods can sort of inform and sort of help us meet our mission in this new center. But you may be wondering, what role could meta-science sort of tell us, or sort of how could it engage these conversations that are going on right now around these issues? So over the last 6 years, my colleagues and I have been running this lab. We call it the Data Lab, and we've been spending all of this time thinking about how information, rumors, ideas, how they spread, how they aggregate, both in science, so that's sort of the science of science work, and also, of course, online. And I think the kinds of sort of characteristics that you would see in sort of social network formation in one system, a lot of times you'll find in the other system. And the ways even that we aggregate data, I think there's so much to share. And of course, I'm partial because I feel like I live at that interface. So there's certain numbers that just sort of are so thumping heavy that they should garner our focus, no matter what we're studying on, at least in this space. So imagine here, this is all the users on the internet. They're much smaller, of course, than a pixel. This is basically at any one time how many people are on YouTube. And if you include, so it's the second most visited site in the world behind the other major alphabet company. And it gets over 5 billion videos, or more than 5 billion videos are watched per year. I mean, these are insane numbers. The point here is that a platform like this, it has to be affecting public opinion. It has to be sort of moving the needle if it's on a science issue. And I can tell you, if you've been following this issue, YouTube is, it's trying to do a better job, but it needs to do much, much better. So let me give you a personal example within YouTube. So my 7-year-old son and I have spent a fair amount of time going to the live International Space Station feed that you can get on YouTube. So you can go there and you can watch in real time the International Space Station move around the Earth. And for 45 minutes, it's in dark, so you can't do anything. So sometimes we'll check and it's in the dark and we'll go clean our room or whatever. Or actually, not clean our room, play baseball or something, I don't know. And then we come back and then we'll see where it's at and use that as a chance to talk about whether it's a weather system or where it is over the planet. And it's a great learning device. It's a great sort of conversation starter about science. And he drives most of this, and I'm just kind of there for the ride. And when I'm there for the ride one time, I took a snapshot of what I was seeing on my laptop. This was my laptop. Looked at the recommendations that I was seeing while we're looking at the live feed, and this is what I saw. So while I'm looking at a oblate spheroid object, those that are astronomers or those that know much better, I'm being asked to come hang out in a video forum that's talking about asking the question: Is Earth actually flat? Is the Earth actually flat? With footage over 80,000 feet. I mean, this one that was actually a response to that, and on and on. And actually, so what I did is I went into incognito mode, thinking, oh, maybe it's because I've been studying misinformation, and Google's cookie, the data in my cookies, sort of is thinking that I need to watch this kind of stuff. We actually, a postdoc in our lab actually went to the Flat Earth Conference in Denver this year to learn more about these people. I can tell you all about that if you're interested. But it was even worse in incognito mode, which was surprising to me. I had, for every 10 recommendations, I was getting even more flat Earth, and it wasn't just flat Earth, there was far, more conspiracies than that. And so really the thing that's really been hitting sort of me on the side of the head is that technology is not a neutral bystander, not for regular day-to-day activity, and certainly not for science. And so that's sort of the issue that I've been focusing a lot, my colleagues and I, and I'll mention some work that's being done by Jason Portnoy here, a PhD student, and Lanu Kim, who is a student at UW, who's now a postdoc here at Stanford, working on these kinds of things. But actually, the example I gave before, this International Space Station thing, is pretty innocuous when you look at many of the examples that have come since I took this snapshot. I mean, many. They're almost in the news every single day. How many people know what Cemex is? Cemex is an $18 billion multinational company that's located in Mexico. If you would search Cemex on YouTube and look what the top videos were for Cemex, this is what you'd find. Hillary Clinton, the truth is enough about these, child sex trafficking ring site on Cemex property, child trafficking camp, Cemex near Santa Cruz River, all of them. If for those that don't follow, QAnon is a conspiracy, a highly conspiracy group that has been promulgating this kind of story between Cemex and actually other international companies and these child sex rings. Now, if you go to it now, if you search it on YouTube said they've cleaned it up. But every time they try to clean it up, another story comes. So just a couple months ago, if you read this New York Times article, this was one of the most disturbing that I've seen. And this is only, we could do the entire talk on how poor these major platforms that own the majority of our collective attention in the world, at least it's online, they're actually making it really easy for pedophiles to get content that they're looking for. And the way that they found out is this individual, I think it was her 10-year-old, posted a video of herself, and the next day, or it was like the next week, she found 400,000 visits on that site. 400,000, what was going on? So they looked into it further, and the recommender systems, this automated system out of control, had started gathering or sort of found that it was great material for all these individuals on the internet that were looking for partially clad children. And of course, they responded right away. YouTube, oh, we're very sorry, we took it down, and I could keep going and going. So it is a problem. It's not, again, it's not just an innocuous problem. And so this is something that we're thinking about, but again, it pushes into science. So I'm going to start moving a little bit into science and just talk just briefly about how I said before, technology is not a neutral bystander. Well, either is something as simple as interface design when we're doing information foraging. And we depend on this in science, since we live in these digital environments, to do this kind of information foraging. So if I'm telling you that minor shifts in design can have big effects, you're going to want to see some examples and some data, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So one of the biggest changes, so we had one of the senior level engineers at Google come and talk about sort of the history of Google. And they've been making thousands and thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of changes to the interface of Google for, since its inception. The one most impactful by a large, large margin when you look at engagement and all the other metrics they use was the autocomplete feature. It just blows everything out of the water. They could have stopped doing any sort of interface design, done that, and it would have been successful. It's what they get the most engagement on. It sort of gives you a sense. I use it all the time. It gives me a sense of what I'm looking for. So if I look for Metascience here, you can see sort of my own search there. You have Symposium. Good job, actually. Google found the Symposium 2019, at least in mine. I'm curious if others. But I did find this Therian Saga. Does anyone know what that was? I have no idea. So I actually went and saw, it's this, I think it's a role-playing game or something, but if anyone knows anything else about Therian Saga, I'd be curious, and how it relates to Metascience. So, I mean, these autocompletes then sort of took off in all sorts of interface designs. If you look at them if you look at other large platforms like Facebook, and you were to search something like this to maybe get a sense of sort of the overall feeling of Facebook, you might see, My Husband Is. Some of you may have seen this one. It's a good example for demonstrating sort of the power of these things and also what they can say. You would see that, at least those that use Facebook, husbands were sort of viewed pretty proud or pretty highly. But if we switch back to Google, you would find something completely different. Yeah, and I actually looked this up. I wanted to check today to see if it's improved much. It hasn't, actually, unfortunately, since the time that this person took this. This is pretty good. So what is the impact of search engines on science? I've kind of talked generally, and now I'm going to sort of move more directly into maybe how they're affecting science. So before the digital transition that we've gone through over the last 30 years, we had sort of what I call sort of academic search 1.0. And in that case, and I still love doing this, I live in a library school, and I have a fondness for libraries and librarians, and they, this ability to walk into a library, find the article, go to the printer, copy it, and in the meantime, you're sort of finding books and journals and articles that you would have never come to the library for, but you found them and they're relevant. We just sort of kind of missed that. I kind of missed that, and so I try to do it myself. We now live in this sort of academic search 2.0. And in this world, search and evaluations are inseparable. You can't separate search. So what we search and how we search very much affects who gets credit, because whoever lands on the top 3 results, turns out the top 3 results on Google Scholar, based on some reports on this, constitute 50% of all clicks. And that's sort of general. I mean, actually, it turns out to be, that's a conservative estimate. It's likely much higher if you look at the top 10 in regular Google searches. But the point here is that search and evaluation, it has, and we know the effects of evaluation. We've been talking about it at this conference. And so the sort of this interplay, as I think it's important to think about. And something that Carl and I talk a lot about is that this major portal, one of the most important tools that we have, and this is, not to knock down any of the other great work that's going on, I'll mention it in just a sec, the other search engines that are arising in this sort of golden age of academic search. But Google Scholar is the main portal, for better or for worse, and I think actually for the worse in some ways. Well, one, there's an unknown algorithm. We have no idea what the data is. You can't customize it. You can't extend upon it, and there's very little community development despite the attempts over and over, including me and many other in the community. And if you don't believe why this is a serious thing, is go to the Killed by Google project. This recently came out. It shows all the hundreds of projects that, or the scores of projects, we'll say, that have been killed by Google that were much even bigger if you look at actually usage than Google Scholar. So what if they turn it off? I mean, they say they're not going to turn it off. I'm glad that they say that. But the part that bugs me is it's one of the most important tools we have, but we're not allowed to communicate or sort of engage with that and do things to accelerate science. I'm very frustrated and have been for a long time about it, even though I use Google Scholar every day. But the good news is that we do have sort of academic search 2.5. We have a lot of other services, including Meta, who's represented here, Semantic Scholar, Clarivate and others, and JSTOR and Microsoft Academic, they are trying to push the envelope. There's other groups, and I'm hoping they push it enough that Google Scholar will innovate. And again, I don't want to knock Google Scholar too much because they provide an amazing tool for the world for free. But I would in a second take all my grant funding and devote it, donate it to this tool if we could somehow get an engagement with the rest of the community. So let me just sort of walk through an example, and I'm going to start showing you some data. So I was trying to find a term that I might know that most people in here wouldn't know. So I spent a lot of time thinking about stomatal networks and stomatal conductance and its relation to photosynthesis. Maybe there's someone else out here that's done this, and great, we can talk later after. I still find it very interesting, but I was trying to find something you didn't. So if I go to Google Scholar and I was to do this, this is the result that you would get, at least on mine. And it turns out Google Scholar is much more consistent if you look user by user. So in a regular Google search, we all will get different results many of the time. More stable in Google Scholar. So this is kind of what you would probably get if you guys all search this. My question to you is, how would you evaluate what to include if you had a deadline, kind of what Dorothy was talking about, where you have to sort of, you want to either confirm something or your midnight deadline is requiring you to find a reference that's related to something around photosynthesis and stomatal conductance. How would you decide to do that? I mean, you're not going to read the paper, of course. So you might not even read the abstract. So you're just sort of looking at this. This is what you get, move on. Okay, so I'll give you, maybe some of you recognize that I whited some things out. Okay, I'll give you some names here. You might think, okay, if you let me look at the author, I'll be able to better to ascertain whether it's useful. Well, none of you are probably in this field, so you probably don't have any clue. So you might say, okay, let me click on this. There's a link there. That might take me to someone who has an H-index. This is not the person that the H-index. I just sort of whited this out. It's an example. Turns out to be Yuri, but it's just an example. You might look at the index and go, this is a really high H-index. The paper's probably good. And these social cues are beneficial in some ways. So our biases can be terrible for us, but they can also be helpful in some ways. So you look at this and you say, okay, let's do this. But we all know the problems with H-index. I told you that search and evaluation are interlinked in our problem. And there's all sorts of misuse. We could all probably talk hours and hours. There's literally probably 1,000 papers that have been written about the misuse of metrics like H-index. But I just wanted to give you probably the worst one. It's a colleague of Carl and I. It was an email that she received. I won't put the name because I don't want to reveal anyone. But it gets, to me, the award for the very worst misuse of this social influence cue. Here's the email. You don't know me, but I'm a fellow academic. I also noticed you have a pretty good research prestige as indicated by your H-index of 15. Even one paper of yours has been cited 170 times. This is great considering you are pretty new at academia. My researcher prestige is not bad either, but I've been in it a bit longer. Link. I know, so we remove this. I know how hard it is for academics who are single to find a mate. I've been a single for a long time. If there's an off chance, just an off chance that you are single, please pick me. I liked your work. It is very interesting, and I think you are quite attractive. I would like to go out on a date with you. What do you say? Let's start a wonderful romance. So if anyone gives you a bad example of H-index, I just don't think they'll win this award. Okay, so the point here is that this is how far science has gone with these. But also the main point, if there's probably nothing that I've said that's of use so far, is that technology amplifies social cues in science and society. So I said, okay, here, you could look at the people. But you might be influenced by these H-indexes, which we know are problematic, and then sort of keep facilitating this sort of feedback loop. All right, I'll give you the title of the journal. You look through there, you go, oh, look at that. There's Nature in the second one. I have no idea what the annual review of plant physiology. Turns out it's a really good journal. It's a review, though. Maybe you weren't looking for a review. There's Nature. Okay, that should help. Or, this other one cited pretty well, too, and it's not Nature, so maybe it would be good as well. So you might do this sort of thinking process. Then you might go, let's just look at the citations. So you look at the citations. This one's been cited 5,489 times. That must be the one. Other people said it. It's not my field. I'm citing across fields, which we know is problematic, and this is when we depend on these social cues more. We might even look at the links. It's been shown, if you have links available, that might influence what we cite. There's all these different things, and I could go on, institutions, et cetera, that influence what we're doing. So if we had all these things, how would we study it? Well, one of the things that we could do is we could use eye tracking software. We could take surveys. But we're at a Metascience conference, so I'm going to talk about how you can maybe possibly address this through these macro level ways. So, a lot of people have been talking about the Matthew effect. Everyone sort of knows that it's rich get richer. Although, for those that aren't sociologists, that you should appreciate that Zuckerman was very much a part of that, that contribution of that theory. And then one of the questions that we want to ask, and others have asked, is this democratization of science. Are we, with digitization, and this was this promise when this technology came about, are we sort of focusing on a wider, collectively on a bigger part of the population, or is it a smaller side of the population? This is the kind of question that we're after in several papers that I'm going to mention here, and it also relates to some other work that other people have done. So the idea here is, so if we work through kind of this example that I have, you can, so one way that you might think about these is you browse the broad literature, you filter it through search engines, hidden papers are discovered, you click and read hidden papers, you cite less visible but more relevant papers, and this would result in a more diversified citation distribution. The other sort of scenario might be that you browse the broad literature, you filter it through these search engines, you look for that highly cited paper, which was the scenario we just went through. You click and read top results, you cite those highly cited results, and in this case, you have this concentrated citation distribution. Now, James investigated this question, James Evans here in the crowd, back in 2008. And I think when we talk about early important meta-science papers, I think this was really important. It was trying to look at sort of whether we as a collective were becoming myopic in the literature with the digitization of publication. What he found is that there was sort of this concentration. He used the HHI metric as a way of looking at concentration. And certainly, I remember seeing this paper at the time, certainly influenced me. It was important, but what was interesting was there was a follow-up. James obviously knows about this one. It was a response by Vincent Laviere, who both James and Vincent I respect tremendously. They're highly productive, and they're sort of early people in this field that we're calling science of science or meta-science. But you'll see in the abstract, the article challenges recent research. If you get cited in an abstract, a lot of times that's not a good thing. So Evans is cited here in 2008. And good thing or bad thing, but I'll tell you the rest of the story in just a second here. My favorite line of this paper, though, is because of multiple measures used, I make fun of Vincent on this one, the present article provides clear and practically irrefutable evidence. So James, you have no luck in this one. I don't know if you're going to win this battle. So we've talked about the niceties and the problem that we're all too nice. I wish we'd just bring little boxing gloves and maybe we sort of box it out a little bit and then we feel better and we can have this battle. So here's the thing that's going on with these two papers. If you're asking the question of whether we're narrowing science, Evans on one hand is saying that we're seeing this concentration. If you see sort of citation count and you order the papers, Vincent was basically saying, no, we actually get a much broader. So we were interested in this and we wanted to see who's right. So this is work that's been done. The results in the next three papers are Kate Stovall, UW Sociology, Lanu Kim, like I said, who's a postdoc here in Stanford, and Jason Portnoy, who is a PhD in the I School at UW. So these are the data sets we used. We used the Web of Science, like many people, Archive, Microsoft Academic Search. I'll mention some of these things as we move through each of these results. So the first thing we want to do, talking about replication, we wanted to figure out, at least when we looked at Vincent, who wanted to look at diversification. It's a very simple thing. He just said, if you look at all the papers in each of these years, and you look at the percentage of ever been cited, is that going up, or is it going down, or is it staying flat? So here in health, we replicated it. We find that we almost get the exact result, even after we've updated since 2009. We now have it to 2019. Over the last 10 years, almost exactly the same. It still is going up, same trend. If you look at these other fields, humanities, mathematics, computer science, and social sciences, you get the same thing. The problem is, what Vincent didn't take into account, and I'll even say, and I could talk to James too a little about this too, even talking at dinner last night, is that we need to be able to compare to something. We need to take into account the number of publications and citations in each of these years. So you can take the same network and they just shuffle randomly the citations, and what you get are these very similar curves. So the dotted curve, so the solid curve are the observations. The dotted curve are if you do this random mixing. And so you can look at the proportion of ever cited of papers in this random, and you compare it to the observed, and then you can do all sorts of normalizations. You can divide by, you can calculate z-scores by comparing the two distributions. And what we see overall is that, yes, you do see, like Vincent said, he was correct. If you look at just the observed values, you do get more diversification over time. But if you then compare it to this sort of random environment, it actually is dropping and becoming more concentrated. So James' conclusion seemed to be more correct in that. So good job, James, but good job, Vincent, too. So the point here is that we seem to be seeing concentration. But this isn't what we were necessarily interested in. As I've mentioned from the very beginning, it's not conducted in a vacuum, and or especially when technology is involved and social cues are involved. And so what we really wanted to ask is not just whether it's narrowing or concentrating. We wanted to look at specific new technology integrated into the science environment and see what those effects were. And of course, the first place to start, because I've been talking about search engines and recommender systems, is what the effect of search engines and recommender systems on what we read, what we cite, and who we reward. So if we go through and follow the same kind of methods that we did before, it's basically just already what I've told you. We can trace these distributions. We can do them over these boundaries of new technology. Turns out Google was sort of formed in 2004, so we have a natural boundary. We can't really get a causality, but we're working sort of on suggestive evidence, at least at first, until we get the right machinery for it. And then we look across within boundary and interdisciplinary boundary. We want to see if there's a difference between within patterns and interdisciplinary patterns. Okay, so here's the idea. We're looking at, here's the boundary, here's Google Scholar when it was invented. We want to see, we have some sort of distribution of citations. Is it concentrating or is it diversifying? All right, so we use as our measurement devices all sorts of things. The one that's the most easy to interpret, I think, is just look at the number. You basically look at the percentage of papers that own some X percentage of citations. You basically see who owns most of the wealth. Now, there are, one scenario you might have more of the papers owning the wealth, whereas in other scenarios you might have less papers owning the wealth. And the wealth, what I'm talking about here, are citations. All right, so Google Scholar, so if we look at the results here, is this concentrating or diversifying? Here we're looking at the citation share of the top 5% of the papers. And we start in 2000. We want to sort of go over this boundary. And again, we're just going over the boundary. We haven't sort of met with econometricians yet on how to do this, right? It would be great if we could set up an RDD or something like that. But at this point, we're just sort of watching over this boundary. So it turns out the way you interpret this value is 1.6. It's 60% what you would expect in this random environment. As it goes over the border, you see an increase. This is just looking at two major fields, mathematics and sociology. We've looked at many, many others. And there are very similar patterns, but there's diversity, of course. Turns out over the boundary, we seem to be getting more and more concentrated. If we look at this diversity measure, which is just, again, very simple, which I like about it, percent of ever cited papers, we have a normalization. The way you interpret it is if this moves down, it's becoming less diverse. And in this case, it turns out it's going sort of in that direction. So the sort of results so far is that we think, it does, over this boundary, not saying for sure that it's search engines, but this is sort of one macro level approach for doing this. That was the within field. But what about inner field? This is the more interesting thing, and there's been many, many sort of scientometric papers and science of science papers that have looked at different things like interdisciplinary or inner field citations and how those are very different. So within field here, this is the same result that I showed you before for these two fields. If you then look at inner field, you see it much more accelerated. So the sort of take home here is that when you cite something outside your field, like stomatoconductance, like I showed you through that example, you may be more likely to follow a social cue, like the number of citations that exist, and they've been there. The citation number has been there long enough over the boundaries that we've looked at. If you look at inner field citations, the diversity measure, same thing. It's sort of similar qualitative results, but even more extreme when you look at interdisciplinary. So the point that sort of take home here is that citations do seem to be becoming more concentrated, at least in just this initial study, and this is just preliminary studies so far in sort of engaging with this. They're becoming less dispersed, and maybe search engines are playing a role. We're working on that hard to try to figure out whether we can tease that apart. So the next exciting thing, and this is very preliminary data, I wanted to show show some data that is first time we've shown this, and Jason's sitting in the audience. He's probably scared to death that I'm showing this data. He has spent basically a year cleaning this data. It's the most dirty data. Dirty, that's the wrong word. The messiest data that I have ever worked with in all the years that I've been messing with data at this scale. It's really, really messy. If you ever want to help clean usage data, that would be amazing. Here we have about 3.5 million articles. We do have IRB support for this. To look, JSTOR allowed us to engage in this. It's anonymous data. We don't know individual users. And we have over half a billion usage events from 2008 to 2019. And the idea here is to look at something very similar to what we did with citations. So again, I'm just sort of big caveat. We're sort of semi-confident, but that sort of imputes sort of being sort of half confidence. I think we're quarter confidence on this. Actually, I should just show here. This is what usage looks like. We're in the millions. People come to school. They come back to school after break. They get really interested. They don't care. They come back here. They download a bunch of stuff. Tests are coming. That's sort of the cycle that you see there. It shows how cyclic just academics is in general. And this looks at the total downloads by discipline. You can see JSTOR is huge in sort of the health, life sciences, bigger in the social sciences, political science, the humanities, et cetera. And those are the different fields we're looking at. This is the breakdown, total breakdown by regions, Americas, Europe, and Asia, the major ones. Nothing sort of surprising here. The most interesting one is this one. Looking at refers and how that has changed, at least from the beginning. We actually have data beyond into the 1990s, which is really where we want to go, but it's even messier. And I'm trying to talk Jason to work on it, but he's like shaking his head, no way. From 2010 forward, you can look at the big take home here is that refers from academic institutions to one of the biggest archives. JSTOR is one of the biggest ones. I would love it if Google Scholar gave us their usage data. They never would. What we see, and this is, we're talking, when at the beginning, the raw days, billions of usage events. The academic refers are coming down. Google in blue is going up. And sort of Google Scholar, if you combine them, it's even greater. We are seeing more and more into these archives. Just Google and Google Scholar are deciding where you're going in your path. Asking the same question, we can look at things like Gini coefficients, the Thiel index. We can look, and we're seeing sort of a gentle rise in Gini, but this isn't before the transition. This is sort of, again, sort of preliminary, and we're looking at this. If you break it down by refer, this is where it also gets interesting. So when you look at something like the Gini coefficient up there at the top, green is Google Scholar, and you're seeing a rise, and if you look at top 20%, you'd see the opposite direction. For Google, it's slightly turning down. So again, that indicates, we still have to interpret what this means, and we don't fully confident in that yet. But what it suggests is that Google and Google Scholar are concentrating as possibly on on a smaller version of the literature. And this is just for fun. I'll put this, and then I'll finish with my last little analysis of it. So who wants to guess who uses Google Scholar the most of the fields? Any guesses? Well, I'll just put it out fast. Statistics and ecology. Statistics sort of surprised me a little bit, or maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. And the least from Google Scholar, from all of these usage logs, was art, history, and music. They don't care about Google Scholar. Good for them. I think that's great. So fields with the highest Gini sort of had the highest inequality, I guess, as one way of measuring it. And there are problems with Gini, of course, because you can get same Gini, but but different inequality. Health sciences and health policy are the fields with the highest, and fields with the lowest Gini are religion and archaeology. Okay, let me just finish here with our last question that we're asking. So what, or at least for this talk, is what's this role? Is the same kind of question we're asking, but we wanted to know whether journals still matter as credential markers. And other people have looked at this in different ways, but we wanted to look at it by removing one of the major confounders. It's hard to look at the quality of an article if it sits within a journal that has prestige and reputation it's carrying with you. So we had to come up with a way of separating those, divorcing basically the reputation of the article from the reputation of the journal. So we wanted to know, not high quality, it's probably the wrong word. Several pushed me on that when Jason has his poster. That was a good push. But it's high cited papers, and what's the effect on subsequent citations? So we look at this again. How do we decouple is kind of what we're saying. This is actually a poster, so Jason's already presented this. What Jason did is he and Lanu did, they took papers that landed in the archive. And this relates to OSI because they're providing this great place for preprints as well, and looked at the rise of citations in these preprints and their result and where they sort of, after they landed in a journal, what happened afterwards. So we use 3 fields that have been around actually since the advent, basically, of the archive that have robustness through all these years. We then had to use Microsoft Academic Graph to identify the DOIs. And then we had to consider, we consider these things sort of independent measure of paper quality. So there's a poster you can go if you want to learn more, but I'll just show you the main take-homes. The first thing is citations to preprints before they land in a journal are going up, at least for these fields. And we've actually, we examined other fields. These are the ones we focused on for that time period, but they seem overall to be going up if you look at the number of citations to these preprints. If you look at essentially here, if you try to look at whether you can predict, given the journal influence, so as journal influence increases, the predicted number of citations. If you do that with no citation information, you see here the key. You still get a curve, this little red line. That indicates that journals basically still matter, at least in our interpretation. If you add even just 5 citations prior to publishing in a journal, it really climbs. Then, if you wanted to look at whether it's, this is over time, basically, we have this sort of weird time axis here. It's just basically, you can think of it as, as the citations grow, which they do with the archive over time, if journals didn't matter, these lines would collide and come together because each one of them represents a different journal influence factor. But in fact, not only are they not coming together, they're going up. So for all you publishers out there, it looks like journals don't matter. And I guess in some ways, I shouldn't be surprised. It's another social cue that we're still using, despite the fact that we have preprints and despite the fact that a lot of us want to get rid of journals. High quality preprints, the big take home here is that this is probably the most surprising result, and then I'm finished. The most surprising result here was that again, quality isn't the right word, high-cited preprints, so those that get lots of citations, are less likely to be published. So again, if you sort of look over time, people that have high reputation or write these highly cited papers, they don't take the time then to work through the peer review. They actually, and it's decreasing significantly. This is the probability that it's going to go into a journal. It's actually decreasing pretty significantly. So that was a pretty surprising result. So take home here as a conclusion, it still matter. Now, knowing these things, what can we do? We can improve science and technology by looking at academic search. We can build recommender systems, which we do, which incorporate serendipity. We can even create new search engines. My colleagues and I have built this new search engine that doesn't start with social cues, but with the main figures. And we've done some fun computer vision stuff to try to identify the main figure and use that as the point entrance into a search engine. And again, we're in this golden age, so hopefully we can work with the community that's wanting to work with us. So these are the main take-homes of everything I've talked about today. There seems to be kind of a narrowing of our collective view on literature if we look at this as a study. Search engines, seem to be contributing, possibly, with support, or maybe contributing to this with, support from the citations, usage analyses. Journals still seem to matter, and high-cited papers are taking less effort going into journals. Here's the point, that we need to be aware of these macro-level patterns as a way of informing. This is, hopefully, if we learn anything from this, the practice of science, and not let social cues override science. So with that, I'll end with one of my favorite paintings that, actually, Carl and I, when we were in Rome this year, we got to see the Caravaggio's Narcissus, and I think, but it's sort of, when I look at this, it makes me think a lot about our current time. One, we need to, in science, not sort of be, echo chambers is, we're really probably talking about filter bubbles, but the sort of metaphor I think plays well, at least with me, that, we don't want to be in this sort of closed system. And most importantly, if you sort of extend outside of that metaphor and think of it, science as a whole, in this world, this misinformation epidemic we're in right now, I think science needs to engage and get out of their cavern is more importantly than ever. So with that, thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions. I think it's appropriate that I let James sort of jump in there.
I was sitting there.
You sat as close to the mic as you could. I knew that. Yeah.
Anyway, so I've got two questions. One, what's the rate? The rising or falling rate of interdisciplinary citations, relative to this kind of time, it's going to be very difficult for you to temporalize when people kind of get on and off search engines. But the reason I'm asking is because it would seem to suggest if you're taking more cues into account as you're reaching across fields, because you have less familiarity, that it's more likely basically that random effects, random differences, like almost arbitrarily small differences, get amplified as a function of interdisciplinary interest in a particular field. So is that amplifying, and what's the effect of that on science? And the second one is, what's the cue, or what are the cues that end up most influencing the pass-through in, say, Google search, Microsoft search? I mean, are people queuing on status of the journal, status of the person, status of the prior momentum of citations in these contexts?
Yeah, so I'll start with the first question. I think it's a really good question, and it's the thing that we want to move into next. And I think that's going to require some mixed methods or qualitative approaches to doing surveys, sitting down with this eye tracking survey, as sort of we talked about, to really find out. And by the way, there's been some research on this. There's people in information sciences that have looked at this, but not specifically. I think there's been less effort for whatever reason. I guess people don't care that much about scientists, but they care about selling multi-billion-dollar products for the rest of the world, where there's lots of research of this kind. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is set it up or work with others that are willing to really go beyond even the macro level stuff that we've been doing, and we do a lot in Metascience work, and try to figure out what they're actually using. If I was to guess, at least when we've had informal conversations and some of this, we've had some very, very preliminary things that we've run in classrooms and things like that, it seems to be citations seem to weigh a lot for people that aren't in science as much. Because they know what that is as a marker. Most aren't familiar whether difference between reviews or different journals. If you kind of know the journal hierarchy, I think that might even be at equal. But I'm just speculating at this point. That's what we have to do it. But anyway, I think it's really important to figure out what are those cues, how do you order them, and it's probably different by discipline. It could be different by gender. It could be different by region of the country. And there's all sorts of things that it could do. But if we know that, and if we had a major search engine that would engage with the science community, we could actually sort of, maybe address those kinds of things. So the first question about, this role of, first of all, whether, interdisciplinary citations are going up. This as well as anyone. That's a really hard question because defining fields and then how you measure it. But let's just say we can do that. If we could actually do that, then I would say, I am seeing that, even the distance, the further my guess is the further distance you go in interdisciplinary space, you would even rely just more and more. There might almost, I don't think it's it's probably not a linear relationship, but there is probably a relationship between how little you know about the topic and some of these social cues. But anyway, I'd love to talk more about that because I think they're highly relevant to things I'm interested in.
Hi,
Yes.
my name's Dean Simonton, and I'm from the University of California, Davis, and I'm a psychologist. I actually thought that picture you had of Narcissus was to represent the programmers for Google.
Well, yeah, fair point, fair. Actually, that would be a great meme. Anyone want to do a quick meme? Get a Google program or any Silicon Valley, because we're sitting in Silicon Valley.
I actually had
that would be very good. I like that.
I had some interactions with some Google programmers, and that's why I thought of that.
So this is
in the initial development of Google Scholar, they actually allowed scholars to give feedback and criticize any placements they made. And I had a complaint because the biggest, most important book I've ever published did not exist. Their algorithms decided that I did not write it.
Well, if it doesn't rely, if it's on there,
I was just the editor, and all the chapters were separate chapters written by the authors in the edited volume, and it was just coincidence. And they insisted on this when this is a real person I'm arguing with. They were just weird that all the authors happen to have one name, mine.
That's a great, I've heard a lot of these examples. That might be one of the better ones.
But that's just a lead into the real question I have. And I don't know if this is true, but I've read that like Google translators and other, I guess Google is the main translator on the internet when you come up with some page and then Google offer a translation for it, that they search the internet for other examples of text in that language to help develop the structure for their translation. But one of the problems is that they're often using pages from their previous translations, okay? And so the question I have is there sometimes some hidden feedback in their algorithms when they're coming up with these suggestions that can cause eventually over time them to become more and more sort of like self-fulfilling prophecies in an algorithmic sort of way? Do we have any, I know we don't know the algorithms, but there's any evidence that there can be a feedback mechanism that means that the citations have more to do with the programmers than with the scholars?
So I'll speculate because of course I don't know, and that's the whole point. Is I would love it if Google Scholar and Anurag, and I'm hard on Anurag, but I really, he's done a great thing, and he can only open the door to so many people. I just wish he'd open the door to one person or something. So I would suspect, and there's I wouldn't say a lot, but there's been some work in trying to reverse engineer what these algorithms are doing. The algorithm is changing maybe by the minute. We don't know. It's a black box to most 99% of the engineers probably, unless the small team that might be working on a particular project. at Google. But one thing that, of the studies that I've looked at where they try to reverse engineer what the algorithm is doing, what's very clear is that citations are used in the search process. So that's pretty indisputable. I mean, it's not the only thing. It's a gazillion things are relating, but if you look at what's weighted the most, clearly is. I love your example because that's something, it's an example where they're making a mistake, maybe don't know exactly what's going on in the community, and you could sort of engage, or if there was a way to sort of correct it community-wise, it wouldn't be an easy problem. It wouldn't, but this is such an important tool that we should be able to do this, that would be able to correct that. And you talk to them, but what about all the other people? Maybe what about the assistant professors that were going up for tenure, that their book didn't get noticed and didn't get the rise and the attention, et cetera, and they don't get tenure based on a bug in Google Scholar. And that's the point of trying to engage.
Yeah,
so
thanks.
Anyway, thanks for the question.
Yes, just a clarification on the JSTOR data. What exactly do you mean by a Google referral? I mean, you're talking there, sometimes you
Yes.
showed papers. I Googled up the paper title, which is a Google search, but I mean, it was not Google recommending it to me, it was you recommending it to me. I do it all the time, like I have a paper from memory, I Google it up. So I mean, can you tell that from an actual Google recommendation on a search topic, or are those?
Yeah, great question. I went through that fast, so it gives me a chance to slow down on that. So what we're looking at is, so when they look at a download event that happens on their servers, what you can look at region, you can look at institution, et cetera. You can see whether it came in from a Google Scholar search. Now, to look at actually all the recommendations, that's hidden behind the kernel. We don't know that. But what we do know is what's coming in from Google Scholar based on what's in the corpus of JSTOR, and we can see which ones are being hit most. So, I mean, it's many steps removed from the effect that it may have. But again, that's where we're trying to be tricky and trying to figure out how to get further. But yes, hopefully that clarified that. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Nick DeVito, University of Oxford. I was curious, the data you presented on diversity versus concentration of citations. So you're looking at 2004 as the break, and I'm wondering if you took into account like the growth in journals. So essentially is the top tier of journals fixed and therefore like representing a smaller and smaller proportion, but it's still where people are reaching for citations. I think about, clinical research, and you have the big five journals where everyone wants to be, and they have enormous impact factors. So that's where the citations are going in the field. So yeah, like did you account for the explosion
so
of
we
journals?
did. Yeah, so what we did, that little dotted line that I showed, that basically what we do there to account for these marginal distributions for the publications and the citations that are changing, certainly are changing by a significant margin over time. We account for that. There's different ways that we've accounted for it. At least how I described it is we take that environment that exists in that time period in this time slice, and we sort of randomly assign based on the number of publications and the number of citations. So whatever we get in that sort of random environment would give you some idea of what the structure itself, without any sort of decision making or any of the external influence of some of these tools or social cues and stuff. So that's how we control for it. Now there's a whole bunch of other things that we have been trying and playing around with, talking to statisticians, but I'd love to talk more about it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, it's a great talk. Lisa Feldman-Barrett, psychology, neuroscience, Northeastern University. So on my way here, I was reading a book by Kevin Leyland, who's an evolutionary biologist. It's called Darwin's Unfinished Symphony. And it's really about the origins of culture, the biological origins of culture. And one of the things that Leyland talks about in this book is how all animals, many, many animals, engage in social learning. They copy each other, and they use social cues to do it. So fish do it, bees do it, and humans, not surprisingly, are ubiquitous copiers.
My kids show me that. Yeah, for sure, yeah.
But there are a couple of chapters in the book where they're doing these games. They're computationally and doing these games, and they're pitting social learning, copying, using social cues against what they call asocial learning, which is basically you yourself try to innovate. So the analogy would be, you go to Google Scholar, you actually read the paper.
Yeah, that'd be unusual.
Well, it might be. Yeah. I do it actually.
No,
I just said to
I'm
my
just
colleague,
kidding.
I must be really fucking weird because actually I read the papers. But okay, but you do that, or you just cite based on social cues. And what it made me think is that humans, almost like many animals, favor social cues almost all the time under almost all conditions, and it's actually productive and efficient. now you could say science is different than, you could also say that people use these search engines no matter how you optimize them. Some people are going to use them for the goal of furthering their career, and other people are going to use it for discovery. And I guess what I'm wondering is, I know it's fun to pick on Google, and I'll just say for the record, my husband works for Google. He's in education. He's an engineer in education. But I guess what I want to say is, yeah, we can blame the tool for sure. But how much do you think that we are bumping up against something that is inherent to our species, which is, as we're social and we rely on social cues, and we often do it because it's efficient, and it might not be the best thing to do in science, but that might be something that we need to actually actively do something about. That no matter how much you improve these tools, it's great to improve the tools, it's great to get Google to open up, I'm not arguing with any of that, but I just wonder, how much is it in our nature as a social species to just rely on these social cues because it's easier, even if it's less productive for our goals as scientists?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So first of all, I will say I love Google Scholar. I use it every day, and I just have,
You don't have
my.
to, I'm
No, I know. No, I totally know. But let me get to your other question. So, or the meat of your question. First of all, we absolutely depend on those cues, and we depend on them here. I use it, that we should use those cues. I just don't want it overriding. So, as a
I totally 100% agree with you. 120% agree with you. What I'm asking you is, what do we actually have to do something actively as scientists, educate ourselves, change our incentive structures, I don't know, to force people, encourage people, make it our gut reaction to not so much rely on those cues? That's all I'm asking.
Yeah, I would say, for analysis like this, and I think what Metascience in general could do for policymakers and everyday scientists and stuff, is just make them aware of these macro level patterns. And then they can decide. They're smart. I can't tell. Just because we create some graphs, that doesn't mean I want to have them change necessarily everything they do in their everyday life. But there might be an effect that might be too much, as if it's something we're tracking over time. And I'll give you an example why social cues matter so much. So we built this engine I was saying where we extract the figures and we sort of tap into the visual sort of high capacity of our brains, and scientists, and you talk to a lot of scientists, and it's that figure that sits with them, and they can identify any paper with just figures. And we had this, and we were getting a great response. And you know what? One of the first requests for features that they wanted to add to the thing was a number of citations to the figure. After we'd been trying to get away from this, it just goes to show that. Yeah, and again, I wanted to. So I guess the answer to your question would be, let's just look at it macro and at least be aware of it, and maybe if it changes too much, then we can worry about certain interfaces. So anyway, thanks for the question. Okay, last question. Yes.
Yeah, hi, Christy Ashwanda, I'm a journalist. And so I'm interested in how sort of science spreads with the public and all of this. And I'm wondering, these search engines now make it very easy for the public to search papers. And I'm wondering if you've looked at all at predatory publishers and journals and whether there's something interesting there. And in particular, we have multiple examples now of vested interests based. So sometimes predatory publishers are sort of like a way for researchers to get more publications, right? But there are also a lot of instances where people are using these to spread ideas or to sort of lend scientific credibility to bullshit, basically.
You got it.
And I'm wondering if that's something, to me, that would be a really interesting research question, looking at, Kaylin's talk yesterday, the slime controversy. Yep. The Lyme, the people that think that chronic Lyme is a thing, they actually created their own scientific organization, their own journal. I just read a book about sports science, and I talk about an instance where these supplement makers were really mad because no one would take them seriously, so they created their own organization, same thing, their own journal that totally looks legitimate, but it's like actually created by supplement makers to do these studies, publish studies that make these things look legitimate.
So first of all, thank you for your efforts as a science journalist. There's 3 groups I'm really big fans of, journalists, librarians, educators. I like engineers and stuff too, but I would prefer, if I could give my money when I die, it's not going to be to engineers. It's going to be to, to others, but it's journalists and librarians and stuff. So, but I just, so to respond to that, absolutely. So Daniel Kuna, who's in here too, we've actually been talking at this conference, and we've actually talked for over years. First of all, how to automate the detection of sort of predatory. It turns out to be really, really hard machine learning problem, but we need the data set first. So as progress over the last 9 months, I have a student in my lab who's now scraped what I think will be the biggest. We actually don't use the word predatory because some of the articles in these are not, and plus it's very controversial, as you know if you've been following.
It's really hard to define what it is,
exactly,
right? I mean, that's...
Exactly. So what we do is we use some standard lists, and we have a rubric that we use, and we've gone out, we now have between, around 50,000, our goal is to get up to 100,000 of what we think are suspicious articles as a way of building some automated approach, but also as a corpus for journalists to use as examples and all the other things you can do with it. So we're doing that. But what we have found with the corpus that we have so far, this is probably the most interesting thing. So Twitter and Facebook almost never release data either. I was hard on Google today, but I won't get on that issue either, but they have been releasing, Facebook through the Social One program, which is at least progress. Twitter has been releasing just in the last year some of these data sets in relation to misinformation specifically and disinformation. And one of the data sets was this one from the IRA and also this Iranian data set. But we peered into it, polling and having this predatory publishing article list to see if they ever were found when they're talking about science. So the take-homes for so far, when we've looked in this data set, first of all, science is used as a wedge just like any other topic. It really surprised me how much we do find it in there. And the articles that they use a lot of times are these pseudoscience journals with very little peer review, et cetera, just the kind that you would expect. More so than I would have expected. I mean, it's sort of an ongoing thing. We're hopefully going to get out here by the end of the year. So we have found that. But what the sort of main question you're asking is around sort of this communication generally, to the public, this bridge between what we do in science and communicate, and that to me is the thing I'm actually most passionate about working on. So I'd love to talk more about it.
Yeah, let's talk.
So thanks so much for the question.